My guest tonight is Jay Dyer. He runs the website Jay's Analysis, a really interesting website. Jay, I'll let you explain your website.
Thanks, Tim. It's a pleasure to be on your show. Yeah, Jay's analysis is basically just a reflection of my own interests, my own thoughts over the last 8, 10 years, and it comes out of a lot of the stuff that I studied in undergrad and grad school, and really it's just an overview of everything from geopolitics to conspiracy to film analysis, comparative religion, espionage, the whole blender mix of all of it. And he's probably most well known for the film analyses. Most people come to the site through that. Those tend to be the big hit getters. So what I do with those is just look at different films and then compare it to reality and what the real story is behind a lot of these Hollywood films and foreign films as well. So it's not it's not a one-trick pony. I hope at least. I try to run the gamut, try to get a big picture of a lot of different aspects of life, and that tends to include a good bit of conspiracy, and that tends to include a good bit of movies. So that's what jaysanalysis.com is, and thank you for having me on. I'm glad to talk with you.
I want to thank you for coming on,
Yeah.
spending time with me. What I want to ask you about tonight was about an article you wrote about a movie, The Godfather. The title is A Family Operation: How the Godfather Trilogy Details Real Conspiracies. Article caught my eye, and how does it reflect reality, and how is it relevant today?
Well, I think in alternative media and the online conspiracy world, uh, we people focus on things like Illuminati or all these sort of ambiguous, amorphous groups. But as you dig into the reality of what goes on in the mob or in the FBI and their counterintelligence operations, or in CIA operations, or big banking scandals, what you tend to see is that the predominant modus operandi, or the best model, if you will, for understanding, I think, the overall structure of what we might call the New World Order, or the globalist plan, etc. The best model tends to be the Mafia model. So you have all the elements there, and as I'm sure everybody knows, the Mafia is essentially dealing with black markets. So what what's really central to controlling the world, if we think about Zbigniew Brzezinski and some of his works, he talks about how it's it's crucial to control not just legitimate markets but also black markets, especially on an international scale. So in regards to the Godfather trilogy, what I noticed the last time I viewed it, it had probably been 10, 15 years since I'd watched it last. This time around, I had a lot better, a more informed perspective to come at the films, and to look at the fact that Mario Puzo in his novel is really much in the same way as Oliver Stone did with Scarface. He's creating a composite, of years of research of actual mafia stories and tales, and FBI accounts and so forth. And so what you have with the Godfather trilogy is essentially, an immigrant family who comes over, rises to power, and part one is concerned mainly with Don Corleone and his passing on of the legacy to Michael Corleone, his youngest son. And then with Godfather 2, we have the rise of the Corleone family going national. So whereas they're only located in one region, one of the five families on the East Coast in part one, by part two, into the 50s and 60s, the rise of Vegas in the 70s.
And so,
Part three,
I'm sorry. Go ahead. You dropped out there for a second. I'm sorry.
it's okay. What I was saying was that part one, the families, localized New York, and they're essentially on the East Coast.
Hmm.
And then, by part two, the families expanded into operations in Vegas, purchasing casinos, etc. So they're going national from regional as being one of the five families, if you will. And so then by the third film, they're international, and Michael is now dealing, with the Vatican, and he's trying to organize large land deals and so forth. But So that's a good model for, I think, understanding how the rise to power actually goes on in the so-called New World Order, right? So when we think of different people like Warren Buffett or George Soros or the Rothschilds or the Rockefellers, and it's better understood from this perspective of somebody like Michael Corleone. So that's the overall thrust of my article. But there are all kinds of tie-ins to real world conspiracies that Puzo actually does detail in his novel that translate into the film. So especially by part two, we see Michael in Cuba prior to the revolution, and then Michael leaves because he realizes when he's down there with the United Fruit Company and these different telecom industries that are going to set up resorts and casinos in unison with the mafia. Michael realizes in the film that the revolution is going to be successful, so he skips town as quick as he can, heads back to the U.S. The revolution happens, and this ends up getting rid of Chaim Roth in the film, who is kind of a stand-in for a Meyer Lansky, character from, say, the Jewish mafia. So you've got the Michael representing the Sicilian mafia, and again, a lot of this is based in reality. So the reason that's relevant is because when the revolution happened, a lot of these Cuban expatriates would flee to the U.S. and they would make up some of the paramilitary force that the CIA would recruit for the Bay of Pigs. So this is where it ties into the JFK assassination and all that. And I don't pretend to be any kind of expert on the JFK rabbit hole because it's such a labyrinthine, series of trails and dead ends. I definitely think that it was a conspiracy. I think the mafia was involved, and we have E. Howard Hunt and people like that, confessing to being involved. But as to who all was really behind that, I'm not sure. But definitely these tie-ins are loosely referenced in the film. And like I said, by part three is where it gets really interesting, because if you know about the history of the long war between different branches of Freemasonry and the Pope and the Vatican, this all translates into the film, where Michael and his family are trying to broker a large land deal, and they've realized by part three that in terms of going international, the best way to hide your assets and funnel money laundering operations and so forth is to create a tax-free charity foundation, right? So this very much translates into the real world, as I'm sure we'll get into here in a little bit. But
Carnegie, Rockefeller.
Bingo, exactly. Yeah. You got it. So once Michael's done this, he's got to broker this big land deal with the papacy. He needs the papacy's because of some ancient legality that involving a Lateran Treaty or something like that. I don't remember the exact detail of it, but in the film, he's got to have the Pope okay his massive land deal, and so this is all riding on the character in the film who is supposed to represent John Paul I. John Paul I, in reality, of course, was elected, I believe, 1978, and he only lasted 33 days. So a lot of people
that's an interesting number, isn't it?
Exactly. You read my mind. So a lot of people have made the connection to the possibility of the 33 days having a 33 degree, 33 significance from something like Masonry, and there's very much there is a very real possibility when you look at the history of the Vatican Bank and the scandal that was going on at that time, and Roberto Calvi is actually a character in the film. One of the bankers that Michael's trying to compete with, who has John Paul poisoned in the movie, is a stand-in, a representative of Roberto Calvi. So Calvi is well known because he was the director of the Banco d'Ambrosia, known as God's banker, head of the Vatican Bank in real life, and he ended up dead.
And he had a very strange death, didn't he?
He had a sort of ritual murder where he was hanging from the Blackfriars Bridge. So what this suggests is, I think the most fascinating part is that in the film, Michael's understudy says at one point, this could possibly be P2. So P2 is the propaganda duo form of Masonry that comes out of, as we discussed, connections to Gladio. Now, I mean, obviously the P2 extended back before Gladio, but there will be a Gladio tie-in to P2 with some of the leftover Mussolini fascists that would be utilized by NATO and Western intelligence in during the Cold War up into the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Sorry, I'll get distracted here. I may have to edit this out later.
That's okay.
Anyway,
Well,
so
Gladio
yeah,
was
so
was the false flag operations carried out in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, correct?
yeah, Gladio,
Yeah.
most popularly known Gladio B, was a sort of a combination of a bunch of cells, and so you had professional hit teams, you had clandestine planning operations, and this was all part of what at that time was known as SHAPE, the Supreme Head Allied Powers of Europe, which was a functionary of NATO. And what they would do is carry out false flag operations, shooting up movie theaters, etc., bombings, blaming groups like the Baader Meinhof of Germany, which was a far left communist cell group, and so from there, what we have is a connection to the P2 connection comes through. Through Gladio B. And the reason for that is that P2 had a similar structure to the Mazzini faction of Freemasonry, which utilized all these Mussolini fascists. So a lot of the Mussolini fascists went over to this form of Freemasonry, and they were very much interested in either ending or co-opting the papacy. So it's very much a mafia style organization. So Licio Gelli is an important character because he sort of co-teamed the Banco d'Ambrosio organization with Calvi, and Gelli was involved in the P2. So when we see the deaths of people like Calvi, we can very much, I think, consider the possibility that this was associated with the P2. And the P2 again is, if we want to understand that version of Masonry, I think we have to look back to Grand Orient Freemasonry, which comes out of France, and back to the French Revolution, where that really has its origin with the Jacobins. And the Jacobin style of revolution, of Illuminism, is pretty much, radical communism, radical overthrow of every established natural order, every form of hierarchy. This is what brings about the Committee for Public Safety in France that just goes around beheading everyone, right? So the beheading of the King of France and all that is a result of this Jacobinism. And so the tradition of Jacobinism, we can find a direct descent into people like Mazzini, Antonio Gramsci in Italy as well. And this tradition passes on into P2, although it takes on, like Napoleon, very, very much a fascist perspective,
Mm-hmm.
having transformed out of its prior revolutionary egalitarian perspective. So that's the tie-in to P2, is that some of these former Mussolini types that were on the far right were recruited into, we got into Gladio, and were used as some of the members of the cell groups. So that's the tie-in there. And again, like I said, there's an interesting document that Pope Leo XIII exposed called the Alta Vendita, and this was the name of a certain lodge. And the Alta Vendita plans were specified that the goal would be to not destroy the papacy this time around, but to actually take it over. So to make the papacy itself in the documents into an engine of the revolution. Okay, so that's why that's such an important historical document. And this prompts a response from Leo. Has that published, and then Leo also has an encyclical that he writes that deals with it in detail, called Humanum Janus, which is about the errors of Freemasonry. So this is a little bit different from what we might see in English Freemasonry at the Grand Lodge of London, which if we look at something like the York Rite, still professes some sort of theism. It tends to have a more, quote, right-wing-ish view, but it's more so in the vein of the opposite end of the French Revolutionary dialectic of the Girondins. So in the French Revolution, you have the left hand of the Jacobins that are the radicals, and then you have the sort of the merchant noble class that still want to retain things like private property and inheritance rights and so forth, and these are called the Girondins. So the American revolutionaries descend more so from the Girondins than from the Jacobins, although in the figure of Thomas Jefferson, we can see some definite Jacobin tendencies. But to bring this up to the present, the reason this is relevant today is because the Vatican bank scandal is something that's still ongoing, right? So it's just been in the last few years, we've seen articles about former Goldman Sachs heads moving over to take over the Vatican Bank, and so it's all the same cast of characters. It's just a kind of a revolving door, between these different agencies and these different international entities, and that's why the Godfather trilogy is such a good image of the way the real world black market actually works.
Because from what I gather, at least from what I understand of the Vatican bank scandal, is that one of the reasons why it's convenient for groups like Pichu Lodge or organized crime, the mafia, or the intelligence agencies is because it's completely secret. So they can
Yes.
do, yeah. So they can use it for money laundering. And was it Bishop Marcinkus who came out of Chicago, by the way, I believe, which is interesting. Who I think was in trouble in the late 70s, and John Paul I was going to
Yes.
reportedly he was going to open it up and kind of expose all the corruption and clean it out, and that was when I guess when people think that John Paul I was taken out and John Paul II was installed, or it was John Paul I, then John Paul II was installed,
Right.
and so people like Gelli and Roberto Calvi and the mob, they're going to use the Vatican Bank as sort of as a vessel or an instrument to launder their money, and maybe the intelligence agencies might use it to operate some of their deep state operations, so their off books operations. Am I correct in that
Oh,
kind
I
of?
think I think you're spot on. I mean,
Okay.
that's really one of the dark secrets here, and I don't mean to. I was a Roman Catholic for about 10 years, so I took it very serious, and saw it firsthand. Not that I was involved in any kind of I wasn't any kind of big player in Roman Catholicism, but I took it very serious, and I was you
Hmm.
know very much an adherent to the traditional Catholic theology. And what you tend to notice, especially if you're interested in research and journalism and media, is that so much of what we're talking about is actually what's going on. So just like in Godfather 3, the foundation that Michael creates is actually a Catholic foundation. He's given the Order of Saint Sebastian in the film, which is kind of a comparable to something like a papal knighthood. And when we think about people like Jimmy Savile, Savile was given a papal knighthood. So yeah, what you have is basically just a bunch of networks and black market black operations that are using a lot of these different they're just fronts basically. Everybody knows about the Mafia front, the restaurant that's having it's got drugs in the back or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's just the same idea but on a grander scale, and this I think is also probably the reason for a lot of the pedophilia in relation to the Vatican, is that a lot of these groups are blackmailing each other. And so if you want to, get this pope to resign like a Ratzinger, or if you want to, do this or that, well, you just release a whole bunch of whatever your intelligence agents have collected on these different priests, or your mafia buds or whoever, release all that and give them all a bad image, and which I'm not saying they're who's good or bad here. They're all kind of it's a dirty game all around here. I'm
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
picking favorites, but
Den of Vipers.
exactly. So yeah, that's essentially how the world really works.
Yeah, and again, put the spotlight or expose, want to discuss some of these various scandals that are afflicting the institutional church, you're not really you're not debating or drawing into question the essential claims of the Roman Catholic Church. So we're not getting into a theological debate here. Nevertheless, it is a 2,000-year-old institution, and it's going to have all the pockmarks and scars and pits and cracks that any institution that is going to have. And when you have an institution that is as pivotal and as powerful as the Catholic Church is, it's going to be infiltrated and corrupted.
Absolutely. I
That's
think,
just
yeah, I think the different books have called the Vatican the world's oldest intelligence agency, which makes sense because of that international structure that it has with parishes and so forth, and
yes.
with confessions. So even though there's the doctrine of the confessional seal that the priest is not supposed to, share anything, I'm doubtful that this has always been adhered to.
Oh well, yeah.
Because the
Don't.
information that's given in confession could be very useful for potentates, kings, queens, spies, etc. So,
Well, that's interesting. You're such a cynic, but that's interesting because when you get back to the Godfather, one thing I want this digression into your explanation of Freemasonry, because it's so for many people it's very esoteric and mysterious, and people just it's too complicated for them to understand. But they got to read up on it, and I am by no measure expert on it. But as I study some of these issues, I feel it's important to understand how these organizations operate, the importance of secret societies, organizations, because it is a method of networking. It's a method of establishing parallel governments. P2 is a great example of that, where it involves top businessmen,
mhm.
military men, police, and it gives them an ability to operate kind of informally behind the scenes, but really control the show. And that's what's important to understand how these things operate. And that they use the methods of Freemasonry in order to establish these networks because they've seen to work in the past. They seem to work in the past, so I think people adopt those methods and incorporate them. Would that be a fair characterization of how it operates?
I think so. I think that
Okay.
it's pretty clear that there's the same type of structure in a secret society as you have in intelligence work, because intelligence agencies have, grades and degrees and security clearances and levels and all this stuff. And you have the same idea with secret societies, or even, overt societies like the priesthood in the Vatican and so forth. So I don't mean to be overly simplified here and try to castigate everything into this, throwing everything into the same bucket, because humans are humans. They're going to be engaged in the
Hmm.
same activities, whatever kind of organization they're involved in. So, and I'm by no means any kind of expert on Freemasonry, but just having, read on both sides of this story of the sort of 300-year war between, the Grand Orient Lodge and probably the London Lodge as well. This is kind of a debated topic as to how far those two ideas of the revolution are actually in competition, or are they actually all run from London? So I guess that's up for debate. But what's not up for debate is the fact that you do have in the history of Catholicism in the last 150 years, 200 years, numerous encyclicals, 10, 12, I don't remember how many now, but all the way back to Clement the 13th, somewhere in the late 1700s, following the French Revolution, the beginning of the issuance of encyclicals condemning Freemasonry. And then you have responses from different Masonic organizations through trying to infiltrate, co-opt, alter, and change, particularly the political process. So what they wanted to do was to get rid of alter and throne, and instead enthrone reason, which is what happens in the French Revolution. They deck the whore in Notre Dame Cathedral as liberty. Think of the Statue of
Yeah.
Liberty. She's the goddess reason. Not that they actually believed in a goddess, but rather that's emblematic or symbolic of natural reason itself. So that's what's been going on for the last several hundred years between Rome and figures like moral Albert Pike and Mazzini and Antonio Gramsci and different figures like that. So most people don't know, though, that the communism as a world movement really does descend from the Jacobin Illuminists and French revolutionaries. So that's where we get world communism from. And I'm of the opinion from my research that that London did, in fact, through its banking power, foster and fund a lot of that revolutionary ethos across the globe, because what that did was allow, if you think about monarchies, there's not many monarchies left.
Yeah.
But the monarch, I mean, there are monarchs, but they're not really, they're kind of in the background. But the King and Queen of England, well, I don't guess there's a king at the moment, but Prince Charles and the Queen, they're very much, I think, powerful people. So to what degree British intelligence has utilized and co-opted all these different Masonic groups, there's some speculation that can be had there as well. But yeah, I mean, I don't think that to understand geopolitics in the last several hundred years, I don't think that it's possible to really get a grasp of it without understanding how black markets work, without understanding how intelligence agencies work, without grasping secret societies and how they're co-opted and used by intelligence agencies quite often. And looking at the Vatican, which is, most of the time geopolitical analysts are interested in this country versus that country. And then you have, on the other hand, the conspiracy researchers who are interested in, this secret society or whatever. Well, they all tie together. It's all the same, power structures involved in, the great game of global blackmail and, beating the opponent at all costs.
Yeah, great global control. But it's interesting because both MIs, British intelligence, MI6, CIA, grew out of the vast financial interests that developed out of the narcotics trafficking trade, opium and heroin, and I think they're the financial, the banking systems, the Vatican Bank, or it's the Castle Bank, which was set up by CIA and work in league with Meyer Lansky. So these various, the netherworld of intelligence intersects with the
Yes,
underworld of the crime world, and because the two both have very, very similar tactics and very similar interests, so
absolutely.
there's a natural relationship there. Getting back to the Godfather and how it reflects reality, you mentioned some of the sex scandals in the Catholic Church and blackmail. Of course, in Godfather Part 2, there's an interesting scene where one Senator Gary,
Yes,
Pat
yes.
Gary, who is, I guess he's a very corrupt and vain man, but he's also proving to be a speed bump for the Corleone program. And I'll let you. How do they pacify? How do they neuter him?
Well, I was in Vegas recently, not to visit whores, but working on a documentary project with a friend of mine, and I got to see quite a bit of. Man, I didn't really see any black market stuff, but I'm saying when you go to Vegas and you see this whole, Disneyland in the desert, it's a sight to see. There's nothing like it. So when Corleone is expanding into Vegas, there's legalities that are standing in his way there, where he needs the senator's approval for these casinos he's trying to get. And the senator says, well, screw you, whatever Italian slang term he uses. He's like, you're not getting anything from me. Well, all they do is sit back and wait until the senator visits one of the Corleone whorehouses, and the senator ends up waking up out of a drug stupor and realizes that he's next to a bloody dead hooker. And of course, the Corleones have this all on film and on record or whatever, and that is the best way to get the senator to go along with your expansion. So, if we think about real world parallels, there's Deborah Palfrey, the DC Madam.
Oh
And then we've
yes.
heard interviews. I think Alex Jones recently interviewed the gay male escort version of the DC Madam. I don't recall his name, but
Vince Howard,
I
Howard
think that's
Vince,
right, right,
right?
right.
Yeah, and Nick
There
Bryant.
you
Yeah.
go. Exactly, the Franklin cover-up author. So from there, what we see is the same way that espionage would be conducted to entrap somebody or whatever. It's the same type of entrapment that any large organization or institution, like in the fictional Corleone family, would obviously utilize that same dirty trick. So that's what happens with a lot of senators, congressmen, people like that want to have their Vegas getaways. the
It stays.
danger there is that,
It doesn't stay there.
there you, well, it stays there with whatever people might be spying on you,
Yeah.
and then that doesn't stay there. You're right. It goes off to, NSA or whoever could use it.
And we have the quick. Yeah, you mentioned the Franken scandal. Of course, that was I think all evidence indicates that was a vast blackmail operation being run by Craig Spence, and the that was Franklin. That was led by Lawrence King, who's an up and coming GOP guy in Nebraska, and he was allegedly, because I think that I've read the books on it, and all the evidence seems to indicate this. They were flying young. Well, I'm not sure the age. They ranges age from like 11 or 12 all the way up to into the 20s. They were shipping these kids, flying them all around the country, servicing very powerful businessmen and political figures. And of course, Craig Spence operated a mansion up here in Washington D.C. that was wired for audio visual. So
Yeah,
there you
and
go.
we saw
Yep.
a mirrored version of that with situations in the UK where MI5 and different groups like that had been watching,
Yeah.
what was going on with, you know, the exact same type of scenario in London. So absolutely.
And this is kind of how policy is made. On your Godfather article, you had a link to a documentary about J. Edgar Hoover, about his sexual misdeeds or how he was
Yeah,
compromised and how.
there's some
Yeah.
really interesting power struggles and battles, about the FBI, and there's, of course, I guess, still internal struggles between the FBI and the CIA and the NSA and all these different groups even today, vying for funding, really. So even amongst the vipers, there's, no honor amongst thieves, I guess. So there's power struggles even still, and I think that we think about Oliver Stone's film JFK, we can get an image of the how there was a cross warfare, I think, between the mafia and J. Edgar Hoover, and again, we think about a figure like Whitey Bulger. There's a recent documentary that's come out talking about how he was actually working with the CIA and FBI. So what happens is, as you rise into this power structure, like Michael Corleone, you need the police. You need the local cops on your side. Everybody knows about buying off the cops or something like that. So once you get into the international scale, that's when you're dealing with CIA and stuff like that. So um, as to the all the in-depth history of J. Edgar Hoover, I wouldn't claim to be an expert on all that, but I do find it fascinating that he gave those hearings talking about how there was no mafia, which he may have been blackmailed into saying that. I don't know, but yeah, we see this. I have an interesting article about Howard Hughes as well, and Howard Hughes seems to figure into this from a different end of the spectrum, a different kind of mafia, um, and his sort of Mormon connections. And my purpose here is not to go after Mormons or Catholics or anybody really. Just giving an analysis of different people's, theses on Howard Hughes, and we have him disappearing to an island, and a Greek island, and stuff like that. So with a lot of these people, that rise to a certain degree of power, especially if you're coming up from the bottom, you don't really have they don't have a conception of how the world really works. So then you get into this dark matrix of things, and you find out that the black markets are really running the whole thing. I think the black market, especially in the U.S., is massive when it comes to the drug trade, especially after 2001 and the invasion of Afghanistan. So hundreds of billions of dollars. We think about those recent articles in the last 2 or 3 years about Wachovia, HSBC, being involved in hundreds of billions of dollars of money laundering for drugs. And so we think about the BCCI scandal back in the 80s, the created bank for the CIA to funnel money for the Iran Contra operation, as well as to the Mujahideen. We begin to see that the legitimate business structure of the Front Corporation is, again, this is all just sort of borrowed from mafia style tactics.
Yeah, and well, I think it was Catherine Austin Fitz has an article about that called "Narco Dollars for Beginners." It talks about just how integrated the narcotics trafficking money is into the economy, into 401ks and Wall Street, and even
Exactly.
franchise
Right. Exactly.
businesses. And yeah, and it's just people just have no idea just how vast it is. It's almost like it has to be maintained for the current
I've
system
seen some,
to
yeah,
be
I've seen
maintained.
some
Yeah,
economic analysts. I don't know if this is
yeah.
true, but I've seen some of them argue that that's actually a big part of what's propping up the U.S. economy is
It's
exactly.
liquidity. That's because it's so leveraged, and particularly with the banks. Um, and so basically, it makes you should it be propped up any longer if it's so corrupt and something's got to give and needs some changes. Yeah, it's something else. But I thought that was interesting as far as the blackmail angle because it kind of tells you how things are run, how the intelligence agencies, if they can listen to every phone call, wiretap, and observe everything, they can pretty much undermine everybody, and they can make sure that the worst do get on top, so things can be managed properly.
Well, yeah, yeah,
And it seems to be that's what's
exactly,
happening.
and then
Did you see the or listen to James Corbett had a recent posting about Cacistocracy?
I do follow Corbett, but no, I've not seen this one.
It's a theory about organized pedophilia and why the elite would promote it and why it's just a big part of their game. And it might be he had a professor from Denmark. I'm not going to try to pronounce his name, but it's called Kakistocracy. It's the rule of the worst. I think
Oh,
is in
okay.
Greek, and that's why he got it. But his theory is that the powers that be will nurture. In order to nurture psychopaths, they
Yes.
have to perpetrate these things. And the one way you do that is you get a young child, violate him when he's young, and it sort of it breaks this. It's the trauma of it breaks the trust, and you can ensure a stable of candidates to fill these offices as they become vacant. So I thought it was an interesting theory, and it would go a long way in explaining some of
Yeah, it
these
almost
things.
makes you
Because
think that maybe there's like a if they don't have this, they probably will. Maybe I'm gonna give a bad idea out, but
yeah,
maybe you write a program and the NSA could run this
yeah.
program that where there's like a
Oh, geez.
blank slots, and then based on everybody's social media information and data, you can just plug in like the most from some algorithm or something like the worst possible guy
Yeah.
and stick him in there. Here's our top bad guy.
Well, it's so easy because the type of person goes into politics
Right.
usually isn't, what we consider a normal human being. So they have their weaknesses, they have their appetites, and so they're usually easy marks for these things. And that's we had the recent case with the Epstein case. That seems to have all the makings of a blackmail
Yeah, which
operation.
ties in.
I
It
mean,
ties
it just
into all
you're
that
looking, yeah,
UK Jimmy Savile stuff. Right.
yeah,
Exactly.
Jimmy Savile, yeah, and so it's just one of those things. Just again, it's one of the things where I've heard I often heard it said that if you want to understand politics, how the world works, watch The Godfather. That's why your article.
Yeah. No. And that,
But I found your
it
article
really
so
is true.
interesting.
I've
Yeah,
been studying this kind of stuff for probably just about 10 years, and I was when I was reviewing the trilogy, I'm sitting there thinking I should have watched this 10 years ago because you read all
yeah,
these
yeah,
books, and yeah,
yeah.
all the books are good, but it's all pretty much there in this film. You've got all of them in this trilogy, so that really does encapsulate the workings of the world. I think in an artistic form better than
Yeah.
most even of the big policy books that you might read about it.
And it's not just a movie. It's much more than that. In that article, I wanted to bring this up because I thought it was a provocative statement, but very interesting because I found it interesting based on my research. Is you said the Western Atlanticist powers had planned World War One and Two. Um, can you explain that?
Yeah, that
And
might be
or didn't World War One wasn't just an accident? I mean, Archduke Ferdinand and war by
right.
timetables and monarchs and cousins not getting
Well,
along. What was
I
it?
do
Or was it more
ascribe
than
to the
that?
view that there is significant evidence from entities like the Royal Society, the Milner Group, Oxford Roundtable groups, etc., Royal Institute for International Affairs, that in the wake of the sort of demise, or in the demise of the British Empire, that what the empire decided to do was kind of go into more of a shadow mode, and then from this shadow banking, royal society power structure, what they would do is then control kind of from behind the scenes. So from my perspective, that is really the Anglo-American establishment in terms of its power center, the city of London, places like that. And so what they did in the U.S. this is probably a conspiracy old hat for most people, but reconquering the U.S. through the Federal Reserve and things like that, Colonel Edwin Mandell House, and the New Freedom Initiative through Woodrow Wilson and so forth. When you read Dr. Quigley's Tragedy and Hope, he goes into depth in several places about the banking establishment funding essentially the last century's wars. So even though I'm not saying that everything about it's fake or that everything was staged, you do find, the Milner Group and people like this talking about the need for world wars. And what we see from coming out of World War One is the establishment of the League of Nations. And the League of Nations doesn't work as well as they wanted. So you have discussions of needing another world war. And so out of that Second World War comes, the United Nations. So it's all consistent steps towards global government, which are explicitly stated. So to me, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's very much pretty obvious and pretty real, especially when you have all the, the Royal Society Fabian type thinkers like H.G. Wells writing openly about it. So for me, it's more a matter of researching and finding out, to which aspects of this are real or real oppositions. So I mean, definitely, there's a real war going on with World War II. There's a real war, Cold War going on between the Soviets and the U.S. But more so, to what degree, is this in groups like the CFR being orchestrating ultimately towards a long-term goal? And when you read their white papers, that they think in 25, 50, 100-year goals, and those goals are explicitly stated. It's not something that you have to wonder about. You can go and find these British Ministry of Defense documents that talk about flash mobs and riots that came out back in 2007, and here we are seeing the summer of riots and all this stuff. So Quigley explicitly says that the bankers created the idea of fiat currency and the idea of gold notes and so forth, so that the issuance of currency could be controlled and all that. So I'm sure you're well aware of all that, but that's really, when we look at World War One, the Black Hand, there's some evidence to suggest that might have been connected to British intelligence in much the same way that British intelligence was involved in stirring up Middle Eastern conflicts with Harry St. John Philby, T.E. Lawrence, and different characters like this. So, Rudyard Kipling's novels discuss this kind of mystical mindset that these British imperialists had. So when we look at people like Cecil Rhodes and their designs for a global, quite explicitly fascist government, the plans of the Fabian Society, the Royal Society, are to incrementally, bring it in, and then, over a century, 2 centuries, whatever, set up, a completely controlled global government. So again, I know that's all probably conspiracy old hat, but that really is what's going on, and that really is the background to both world wars. That's why you see, different British elites supporting Hitler at the same time as Churchill saying that we need to go to war to stop Hitler and so forth. So that really is what's going on.
So at a certain level, you have the true believers who are going over the top, getting mowed down in the trenches.
It's all
generals,
real, exactly right.
But at a meta level, the Rothschild level, the Rockefeller level, they're just moving the pieces. They're the bankers moving the chess pieces.
Yeah, well, I mean, and we think about the Rothschilds knowing ahead of time about Napoleon being defeated, and you know, them gaining
Yeah, the
exactly, and
horse
then
ride. Yeah, yeah.
gaining the
The
edge with the Bank
Waterloo.
of
Yeah.
England and all that, but all of that is still true in terms of the 20th century wars. Um,
Well,
it
it's
is
intelligence, right?
exactly.
Yeah, getting advanced knowledge, and if you establish the mechanisms for manipulation, if you do establish central banks and you have your men in charge of those central banks, you're going to know in advance what the decisions are going to be, and you can leverage the market and take the proper positions and just get richer and
Yeah,
richer and richer
private
in the
intelligence
process.
comes out of these
Yeah, yeah,
families. We think about the Pinkerton security, or we think
yeah.
about Interpol. Interpol was started by the Rothschilds, so absolutely.
Fascinating. Yeah. And one other, I guess, another piece of evidence supporting your thesis on that is the Reese Committee investigations
Yeah, I
in the
was about to,
1950s,
right, Senator
and there's
Dodd, right?
yeah, oh, or Norman Dodd, and what they found out in 1908, 1909, you had the Carnegie Foundation, which had been taken over by then by the Rockefeller Foundation, and they more or less said the only way we can really transform America is to drag it into a bunch of transformative wars, a series of transformative wars, and lo and behold, what happened? Well, go ahead. How would you explain that? What happened with that then?
Well, I think. By the way, Senator Dodd died in a plane crash. Is correct? Is
Senator Dodd?
or I'm sorry, Norman Dodd. Didn't he die in a plane crash, or am I wrong about that?
Well, he was sickly. I think he died naturally. You might be confusing him with
Okay, that's right.
Boggs.
I apologize for that. Yes.
Senator Boggs, guy who did he didn't like the
Okay.
Warren
Yeah.
report, and he went missing over somewhere in
Right.
Alaska somewhere. Yeah, but they gave his daughter a nice cushy job in the media, so it all worked out. So
Okay. So
Cookie
right. So
Roberts,
with Reese Commission, you
um,
have the investigation of
yeah,
Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie foundations and their influence on education
yeah,
primarily, and then uh, the committee found out that it's not just education, but that there's actually a very wide-ranging influence. And it's pretty common sense if you think about it as to why this would be, is because if you put your money in a tax-free foundation, then you're not taxed. so but that also, just like with Michael Corleone, is a great
yeah,
way to funnel money that might otherwise be under investigation by the FBI or something like that for nefarious connections. But uh, it goes deeper than the corruption, and I think the goal of these different foundations, when you look at their white papers, uh, is very much the same goal as what I'm talking about. Because yeah, there are all these hundreds of foundations and think tanks, and there are divergences, but for the most part, the most powerful ones, when we look at Rand, when we look at the Brookings Institute, when we look at Carnegie, these different foreign policy institutes and so forth, they're all, for the most part, pretty much steering things in the same direction. And it's, usually it's plastered with American flags, and it's supposedly all about America, but it's not really. It's essentially about the same power structure of the Royal Society. They're kind of the ultimate, in my view, sort of penultimate think tank with that's ultimately controlling education. So they're, I think they kind of have an inner party, outer party structure, and then that translates down to the rest of the intelligentsia and the academia out there, and that's why uh, education, in the U.S. is a great example of how we've transitioned away from um, classical methods of education with pedagogy through the trivium or the quadrivium, things like that, into what is explicitly a Prussian then Soviet model of education. So all the stuff that Charlotte Iserbyt talks about, that's all completely accurate. And so just looking at education as a tool of the foundations is a great window into how, even though there might be a whole bunch of think tanks and foundations, the most powerful ones are all taking things in one direction, and it's all the same direction as the ideologies that are laid out in people like H.G. Wells. And it's not by accident. It's not just happenstance. It's not it's very much a controlled money power plan, ultimately by the big banking houses and the Bank for International Settlements and stuff like that. So they're all taking us in that direction.
And outfits like the BIS, Bank for International Settlements, these were established after World War One. Same with the CFR, and same with the Royal Institute of International Affairs. All these very powerful so-called think tanks. Later on, I guess 50 years later, you get the Trilateral
Correct.
Commission created, and all these the people that run these or members of these organizations. They may number into thousands, but a few of them are probably really in the know what's really going on. But they tend to populate the administration, the corporation, the various administrations, and the corporations that are making the big
just
decisions.
look at somebody like Brzezinski, and throughout all of his books, he's pretty consistently laid out where things would go. writing about EMF and weather weapons back in 1972, 73. And he's in Grand Chessboard, he lays out basically where things would go after 9/11 with Afghanistan and the Iraq War, Afghanistan, as well as the Ukraine situation. So all of this is pretty consistently laid out, and all these big policy making consulting figures who kind of hang around in the background as NGO consultants that are actually pretty powerful people. So there's no doubt about that. And we find that when you look at the Trilateral Commission with David Rockefeller in the 70s, when you go back to the establishment of the CFR, and as well as the CIA and intelligence agencies, the Dulleses are all working with the Rockefeller. So it's all the same crew. It's just kind of like I said, revolving door type stuff. Bilderberg Group, also Rockefeller is there at the outset of that as well, with European nobility, Prince Bernhard, so forth. So again, I don't mean to be boring you with conspiracy old hat, but all of this is very much in the historical record. It's not speculation. It's just the reality.
And in order to understand these things, you almost have to draw a sort of a schematic connecting these things, and because that's the only way we get to understand these connections. And it's interesting that if you look at the intelligence agencies, they all came out of Wall Street. And these bond lawyers and corporate guys, or if you get in the psychological warfare angle, a lot of it came out of
absolutely.
the
Robert
was an advertisement guys,
advertising agency that ties into the Howard Hughes stuff as well. So yes,
and Bernays, he all that, so it's there to see. If you want to see it, it's there. Just it's hard to wrap your mind around it unless you do the research and put the time into it. And after a good dozen years of myself looking into it, I'm just now, I think, getting to understand it. And it isn't pleasant, but we, at the same time, I mean, what I'm saying, this is why your websites like yours are so important, because you can't get this information from the establishments, whether it's education, network, the networks, news, the establishment publications. We need independent investigators and scholars like yourself, and people like James Corbett, another one, Richard Grover, Tragedy and Hope, and this is the only way. If you can look at your research and their research and kind of get the bigger picture, then you start to see what's really going on.
I was going to say, I mean, you would think that, the big corporations and there's so much deception out there and so much BS and psyops propaganda. You would think that these big players would be interested in real information, accurate information. So I'm still waiting for my calls for consulting on accuracy and so forth. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But those guys are all good. I touch on a lot of the propaganda because, so much of how we view the world now is read through the lenses in the mirror of Hollywood. And, Hollywood itself is kind of, as I view it, kind of the flip side of the CIA. So they've had a long, intimate connection between, all the way back to crafting, war propaganda films, Howard Hughes used to make war propaganda films. So that's nothing new. That's gone on for ages, and the British did it as well. You can go all the way back to the British using the stage and the theater for propaganda and psychological warfare as well. So it's all ancient techniques, but it's now all just very sophisticated, very scientific. So you have
Just
it is,
it's the
it
allegory of
totally
the
is.
cave,
I've
right?
got a whole bunch of articles
Yeah,
about that.
yeah,
So yeah,
yeah,
I think
yeah.
I think it's weird that this this year, maybe the last 2 or 3 years, the push has really strong. It's strongly been with the AI transhumanism stuff. And I don't mean to go off into some weird topic, but that seems to be like the only movie that comes out now. It's like there's the AI takeover movie. So this very much fits into, I think,
Yeah.
the overall scheme with not so much anything relating to robots coming alive. I don't think that's possible, but um, more so with the idea of warming everyone up to complete panopticon surveillance. The idea of
Well, yeah,
yeah,
it's
right,
like
right.
Google and Ray Kurzweil, and a lot of it I think is also
It does, right.
depopulation and sort of you want to demoralize society. I think you've done a lot on feminism and it's psychological warfare to targeting, well, both male and
Exactly.
female actually, but it's about destroying the family, destroying these what we would say these independent platoons of
Yes.
sovereignty, of autonomy, of people. They don't want independent people thinking, and they don't want mechanics, entrepreneurs. They want workers,
Yeah, and you go
as
back to
Rockefeller
the
said. I don't want
the
thinkers. I want
brainchild
workers.
of all
Yeah.
that. When you look at the next million years by Charles Galton Darwin, or if you look at Impact of Science and Society by Bertrand Russell, Ghost and
Hmm.
Machine, Arthur Kessler, you see explicit mentions of the need to target the idea of individual consciousness. So it's not. You're absolutely right, and gender. So they
And if you look at pornography and feminism, modern art, it all has connections back to
absolutely the CIA was
intelligence agencies.
directly connected to Frankfurt
Yeah.
School people utilizing Frankfurt School art, modern art, absolutely abstract art, all of that.
Why would they be funding modern art?
Well,
Why fund modern art?
just like with
Well,
Hollywood,
divide and
aesthetics
conquer.
has the ability to
Exactly.
educate the populace far more than any kind of boring lecture by some professor. People are going to be going to the movies to see the art of our day. And so, just like Plato said that art has to be controlled because it has the ability to cause revolutions. In the same way, it's not so much about controlling it now as it is just turning it weaponized. So you have the weaponization of culture is really what it's about. And the Frankfurt School guys are explicit about that. Adorno says that we've got to promote everything base, everything disgusting, everything bestial, from necrophilia to bestiality. These are all explicit statements by Adorno. So, and he's one of the Frankfurt School luminaries. So, Western elites from the Fabian Society, Royal Society, all saw that as useful for the implementation of technocracy.
And again, use of the arts, movies, music, and this gets into. I did a recent interview with Dave McGowan talking about how the rock music scene of the '60s was largely a concoction of the intelligence agencies to divide and conquer and marginalize the then budding and influential anti-war movement. Um, Modern art, I guess, is just destroying the beautiful, destroying. I guess we could say pornography. It's destroying the concept of love and fertility and stable
Well, they
families.
even say yes. They even
Just
say
yeah.
that the promotion of the they explicitly say the promotion of the ugly and the deformed, because classically speaking, at least from the Middle Ages and probably ancient Greece to some degree as well, you have the idea that aesthetics, there's a harmony there. So something being beautiful is not completely subjective or relative. That there's an actual objective
Hmm.
harmonization between form, structure, proportion, and so forth. And so for artwork to be truly beautiful, it has to match up to, it has to harmonize. So the implementation of disharmony, of disunity, things out of proportion. You look at the disgusting stuff from, say, Picasso. Well, Picasso was a Marxist. So for Picasso, his art was very much an intentional work of warfare. It was an attack on beauty, symmetry, or order and form. All the way up until even Ayn Rand, who I have a love-hate view of. Her book, Romantic Manifesto, is very good from a philosophical perspective in terms of critiquing modern art, because she shows that it's not really art, because philosophically you need form, and you're not doing art if you don't have form. And I'm speaking philosophically of the conception of form, from, say, Plato or even Aristotle. So in other words, attacking form with
Yeah.
abstract, even though not some of this is kind of gray area because it's hard to exactly define everything that's, quote, modern or abstract. But you get the basic idea
Hmm.
that I'm saying. I mean, what Andy Warhol's
Yeah.
doing
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
not the
Yeah.
same thing
Yeah.
as what Bernini's doing, quite obviously.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I mean, this isn't just pie in the sky. This isn't just theorizing your part. There was the Congress for Cultural Freedom that was run by the Central Intelligence Agency, which funded certain magazines. And you had efforts. We do now know that artists like what was the modern
Yeah,
artist
but
Pollock
Jackson Pollock was
was Jackson
exactly
Pollock
just
was the
like
recipient
Gloria
of CIA
Steinem. So
funds.
all
Yeah.
of
So
the pretty much
yeah.
every
So there you go.
form of what people think is revolution. This is just an old trick. It's just an old trick
Yeah. Yeah.
of
Dividing.
destabilization, of disintegration of the social order. And that's really, I think, what was
Hmm.
going on even in France. I think even the French Revolution was probably foreign powers, money powers, and so forth, utilizing revolutionary ideology as a way to destabilize that society. So,
And of course, the sexual
absolutely,
revolution is, I think, Wilhelm Reich, who realized that the best way to undermine a society isn't to talk about
it's
Marxism,
it's
and
libido,
it's
right?
to talk about sex.
And
Libido
right.
dominandi, yeah. And that's a shout out to
Hmm.
Michael Jones, his book, a great book on that topic. But yeah, it's all these things matter, and it's kind of like it's the Marquis de Sade and his scribblings. And Michael Jones made a point that technology had a big factor in this, because before photographs, what could you do? But it's really the development of photography, then film, that really made this possible. Now, of course, with the internet, it's like no stopping
Yeah,
it
I mean,
now,
we
right?
really are
It's all over the place.
entering the
Yeah,
cave,
yeah,
Plato, and we're entering it quite willingly rather than
yeah.
striving to come out of it. Everyone is gleefully jumping into the cave. It's okay.
Well, Jay, I've kept you a little longer than I said I would, so I'm gonna let you go. Get on with your evening. I'd like to, maybe come back, have you back later on, talk about some other things. There's a great interview here. I mean, we can go
Yeah,
on and on
anytime.
about these
I had a
things
blast. Yeah,
if you
thank you.
wanted to, but you know. Yeah, so great. Okay, well, listen. So just go to Jay's Analysis to read your stuff.
Correct.
Right, correct. Jaysanalysis.com.